So here we move on to a section 2 called comparing algorithms. And here Salzberg is going to talk about the basic typical way that we do comparative studies, what I would think of usually as manipulation experiments, or what Paul Cohen in his book Empirical Methods in AI would call manipulation studies. So he's going to give a basic overview of these and of what kind of methods people use and what some of the problems are with those methods. Number 2, comparing algorithms. Empirical validation is clearly essential to the process of designing and implementing new algorithms. And the criticisms below are not intended to discourage empirical work. Classification research, which is a component of data mining as well as a subfield of machine learning, has always had a need for very specific focus studies that compare algorithms carefully. The evidence to date, and again, he's writing at this point in the late 1990s, the evidence to date is that good evaluations are not done nearly enough. For example, Pitfalls 1996 recently surveyed nearly 200 experimental papers on neural network learning algorithms and found most of them to have serious experimental deficiencies. His survey found that a strikingly high percentage of new algorithms, 29%, were not evaluated on any real problem at all, and that very few, only 8%, were compared to more than one alternative on real data. In a survey by Flexer in 1996 of experimental neural network papers, only 3 out of 43 studies in leading journals used a separate data set for parameter tuning, which leaves open the possibility that many of the reported results were overly optimistic. So just to pull out the data in here, some things to remember. So we have one paper, Pitfalls 1996, that looks at nearly 200 papers on neural networks. 29% were not evaluated on any real problem at all. Very few, under 10%, were compared to more than one alternative on real data. So probably this means only one baseline. And then a survey, Flexer 1996, of experimental neural network papers found that only 3 out of 43 studies in leading journals used a separate data set for parameter tuning. Question we could ask is whether that or not that means they were not using held out test data, blind test data. It's interesting in there that he mentions leading journals. So what that suggests is that having a prestigious publication venue doesn't necessarily mean at all that you don't have any experimental design problems, not in our field anyways. All right, back to the paper. Classification research comes in a variety of forms. It lays out new algorithms and demonstrates their feasibility, or it describes creative new algorithms which may not, at first, require rigorous experimental validation. It is important that work designed to be primarily comparative does not undertake to criticize work that was intended to introduce creative new ideas or to demonstrate feasibility on an important domain. Oh, okay. So I think what he's bashing here basically is the idea that at some point in time, p+1, it's reasonable to compare to earlier work from a time p. So earlier on, that the earlier method probably just doesn't have the advantage of all of the new developments in the field as a whole that your new method has. So what you might be running into is a situation there where it's not that your new algorithm is any better or your new implementation of it is any better, but you might have better tokenizers or a bigger data set or other things that aren't really germane to the argument that you're wanting to make about the superiority of your algorithm. So again, it is important that work designed to be primarily comparative does not undertake to criticize work that was intended to introduce creative new ideas or to demonstrate feasibility on an important domain. This only serves to suppress creative work if the new algorithm does not perform well, and encourages people instead to focus on narrow studies that make incremental changes to previous work. Now, personally, I'm not opposed to incremental changes. Incremental claims of incremental improvement based on really small effect sizes, I think are kind of bullshit. But overemphasis on innovation has led to quite a bit of problems for us, particularly in the area of reproducibility, I think. Let me go back to the beginning of this paragraph since I've chopped it to bits. Classification research comes in a variety of forms. It lays out new algorithms and demonstrates their feasibility, or it describes creative new algorithms which may not at first require rigorous experimental validation. It is important that work designed to be primarily comparative, this is going to be the later so-called empirical work, I think is what he means here, as opposed to more theoretical work or proofs of concept. It is important that work designed to be primarily comparative does not undertake to criticize work that was intended to introduce creative new ideas or to demonstrate feasibility on an important domain. This only serves to suppress creative work if the new algorithm does not perform well, and on the later comparative work, that's my side, and encourages people instead to focus on narrow studies that make incremental changes to previous work. On the other hand, if a new method outperforms an established one on some important tasks, then this result would be worth reporting because it might yield important insights about both algorithms. So again, he's saying not a problem with comparative work as long as you don't take that competitive approach where what you're trying to do is, as he says, undertake to criticize work that was intended to do other things. So perhaps most important, comparative work should be done in a statistically acceptable framework. Work intended to demonstrate feasibility, in contrast to purely comparative work, might not always need statistical comparison measures to be convincing.